Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is Victor Luckerson, two-time editor of the Alabama Crimson White. Luckerson's debut book, Built from the Fire, is a powerful and complete history of the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. I spoke with Victor Luckerson in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Mr. Luckerson, nice to see you.
Oh, so glad to be here.
I know you're back on campus, and in your case, you're really back. What were your years here?
I was a student at UA from 2008 to 2012. History and journalism, double major, but mainly I was at the Crimson White. You know, back then the CW office was in an old derelict frat house right in front of Bryant-Denny Stadium.
Yeah.
So that's where I spent most of my time here.
And you did that, you were editor 2 years?
That's right.
That's
for
very
2 years.
unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's been 3 of us so far that took on the mantle for 2 years. We were a little bit crazy to do it, but I enjoyed my time there.
Well, I've been looking around to see what you've been doing since because of the book and Time magazine and a lot of magazine work. And what is the online place where, I think it's online, where you wrote the article about Tulsa?
Oh, The Ringer, a media startup, yeah.
Yeah. I don't. That one I did not know. This is a monumental book. I mean, it is. We will encourage people here and now to get it and read it. But you've got to want to know a lot about Tulsa, not just at the time of the massacre, but also you've done a job, in a sense, the history of Black Tulsa since 1921. To begin, though, the thing that when you see this kind of thing on the news these days, the place to begin is what a remarkable district it was. How do you describe for listeners, viewers, the elegance, the prosperity of Greenwood?
Yeah, you know that in the early 20th century, Oklahoma was known as the Eden of the West, and Greenwood in some ways was the crown jewel. It was a place of Black entrepreneurship, Black solidarity, Black success. I love to talk about this through people, and so one of my favorite Greenwood entrepreneurs was Lula Williams. Lula was a woman entrepreneur. She owned the Dreamland Theater in Greenwood. She was soliciting films from Fox, Universal, all the major Hollywood studios. And what I love most about Lula is that she really advocated for herself. Lula had a husband named John who was an auto mechanic in Greenwood. And when the couple opened the Dreamland Theater together, John got all the credit in the press, both black and white. But Lula, as we might have expected in an era like that. But Lula took it upon herself to actually, claim her own autonomy. She even went to the courthouse and filed an affidavit that said, I, Lula Williams, own the Dreamland projector, I own the popcorn machines, I own the seats, I own everything in this theater. And, she was able to actually build that theater up into an actual chain all throughout Oklahoma. There were 3 Dreamlands throughout the state. And so that's just one example of the success of the neighborhood. There were also major hotels there. There were grocery stores, doctors, attorneys. There were just so many different success stories in this community that was building up through the 1910s and into the 1920s. And it's just so tragic what happened to have it all be destroyed in 1921.
Something that I have very little knowledge of the history of Oklahoma. That puts me in about 99% of the people in the world, right?
That was me 5 years ago.
But one of the things that struck me and as odd was the citizens in Oklahoma Territory, both the Indian Territory and the pre-statehood territory, were better off before statehood, the black and brown and Native American citizens. It was statehood that made possible a state legislature.
Right.
With consequences.
Yes.
What'd they do?
Yeah, Oklahoma has a very unusual history. It was, let's say, late 1800s, early 1900s, kind of egalitarian in a way. There were black, white, and indigenous folks attending schools together, children. In Tulsa, early Tulsa, there were black folks working in the downtown business district, like alongside white people. But all that was before 1907, when Oklahoma became a state. When Oklahoma became a state in 1907, white folks basically decided to import Jim Crow from the Deep South.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, they actually decided to segregate schools in the state constitution, and the very first law passed by the state legislature segregated train cars. And so I've always thought it was really tragic to learn about that sort of unusually equal history that the state had,
Yeah,
and they did that instead of building on that foundation, they decided to erect this rickety edifice of Jim Crow instead.
Yeah, you'd think that the move into statehood would have been grand. It would have been a real plus. Turns out, once you have a state legislature and a majority of people who run it, they can pass odd laws.
Yes.
This is Alabama Public Television. We're pretty aware of how legislatures work.
Yeah, exactly. But throughout my book, I try to highlight the resistance to those kind of movements. And so as Oklahoma was deciding to pass all of these racist laws, there were actually black folks protesting that movement. A group of black leaders in Oklahoma Territory actually went all the way to the White House, met with Teddy Roosevelt in the Oval Office, asked him to sign a petition that would stop these racist laws from being passed. Ultimately, Roosevelt rejected them, let Oklahoma become a state, and we saw how things unfolded from there in terms of racial animus and racial violence.
Well, there's no doubt it was a remarkable district. I mean, the movie theater, and possibly the finest black hotel in the world,
The
I
Stratford
suppose,
Hotel,
possibly.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
And the restaurants and the entertainers that came through. I mean, really top shelf entertainers who were moving through on tours here, everywhere. The incident, the spark for this catastrophe was, as often is the case, a little bit mysterious. There was a young man, Dick Rowland. Was he an elevator operator, or was he just on the elevator?
He was a shoeshine boy.
Yes.
And then there's a white girl named Sarah Page who was an elevator operator.
Oh, she was the operator.
That's correct. That's correct.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So Dick Rowland was a shoeshine boy working in downtown Tulsa. He stepped into an elevator with a young white girl named Sarah Page who was operating it. The elevator doors closed, and as you said, it's kind of a mystery exactly what happened. It's very likely the elevator lurched, and Dick maybe stepped on her foot or grabbed her arm, lost his balance. However, when the elevator opened, Sarah Page screamed. Dick Rowland ended up running away, and a white man working at a department store in the building observed all of this, and sort of this false notion that he had raped her kind of took off in Tulsa. I think a key thing to understand about this actually is that even with all that happening in the elevator, likely nothing would have ever come of it except for the fact that the white press, Tulsa Tribune, published an article on May 30th, 1921, saying that Dick Rowland had torn at Sarah Page's clothes, scratched at her face, and attempted to rape her. And so that article is really, in many ways, what ultimately whipped white Tulsa up into a fury that led to so many horrific events.
The rumor, well, possibly the information races through the black community that there might be a lynching.
Yes.
That Rowland is not safe in the jail.
Right.
Even though he might be up there on the top floor. He might have been safe.
Right.
Anyway, the movement, there's a rumor, a word spreads through the black community that there might be a lynching. And this is the place, again, as so often, the oddity. The black men, many of them armed, had been World War I veterans. And they decided they weren't going to put up with this.
Exactly. There were so many black soldiers who had traveled to France during World War I,
Yes.
fought for America, not only fighting for the country, but really fighting for themselves and for their own dignity. And so many of these soldiers come back to America. Some of them are beaten, abused, and even lynched in uniform when they come back.
Yes.
And so in Tulsa in particular, I know that when they had the victory parades for soldiers, black soldiers were not allowed to participate in the white parades, actually, there in Tulsa. And so even there in Tulsa, there was this very, very rightful resentment of how they were being treated by white society. And I think that also we know that they had a lot better military training after coming back. And so these men who were very courageous and fought for their country decided that they were not going to let one of their own be lynched. And so to your point, several of these men, probably about 50 to 75, armed themselves went down to the courthouse where Dick Rowland was being held and demanded that he be let out.
You have a turn of phrase in your describing of their going down to the courthouse that they looked military, they looked trained, they looked, when they didn't exactly march down in step, but they had a trained, organized look about them, which more or less terrified the police, the sheriffs, the white law enforcement.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Then there is a shot fired by somebody somehow.
Yes, yeah. What people say is, that so the black soldiers come down to the courthouse. White men obviously are saying that you guys need to disperse, and ultimately these white men start trying to disarm the black men. A white man and a black man struggle over a gun. A gunshot goes off, and somebody said all hell broke loose, basically.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah.
You know it did. The hell that broke loose. Over time, one reads about atrocities, about terrible things that happen. But I have to say, your description of the next, 2-3 days at least, is right at the top of the pile. Partly, I think, the violence is appalling. Arson, looting, murder. But what's so distressing is that a certain percentage of the white rioters, whatever you want to call them, they were either in the police, or what was the business about being deputized or not? Some of them were, some of them weren't.
Yeah, no. In the book, I really try to highlight the role of institutions in how the race massacre unfolded. So after this gunshot goes off, there is sort of shooting going on between the black soldiers and the white potential lynch mob in downtown Tulsa. It's a very chaotic scene. And the black folks end up retreating back to Greenwood over the course of the next couple of hours. But as that's going on, white people are beginning to mobilize for a second phase of what's going to unfold. And as part of this mobilization, the police department of Tulsa began deputizing white men, some of whose names they did not even know, and they handed them badges and stars, giving them the authority to go in and invade Greenwood. In the book I tell a story about a specific white bricklayer named Laurel Buck. He was there in downtown Tulsa when everything kind of began popping off. He goes to the police department and sort of asks what to do, and a police officer tells him, get a gun, get busy, try to get an N-word. And so that was the mentality of the police when they were thinking about what to do about this so-called black uprising. And so, through this deputization, the police and these deputized members were able to gather guns over the course of the night, arm themselves, and then at 5 a.m. on June 1st, the following morning, more than 1,000 white people armed with guns, torches, and kerosene invaded the Greenwood district and began burning things wholesale.
I jotted down, 175 people killed, 1,256 houses burned, 150 businesses lost, 10 churches burned. Something though, all that is grotesque, but something in there that again, oddities catch your eye. Looting. These white people went into houses to steal things, which is that isn't a panic exactly. That isn't some sort of mental rage. That's thievery. Right. When you learned in your researching that they systematically look through people's houses to steal things, what did you think about that?
Yeah, in the narrative about the race massacre in particular, I follow a young man named W.D. Williams. That's actually Lula's son. So Lula, the owner of the Dreamland, I kind of follow her son through the events of the race massacre. And he actually observed, so W.D. was in his home on the night of May 31st. The mob invades Greenwood. They're shooting at his house. They're blowing out the windows. Yeah. He, Lula, and John all escape under a hail of bullets. Ultimately, W.D. gets detained by men in uniform, be taken to an internment camp. And as he is sort of being marched off towards this camp, he actually sees his mother Lula's leopard print coat being worn by one of the rioters. Yeah. And so to your point, it was really not only a time of quote-unquote rage, but also a time of looting and even a revelry. I actually read a first-hand account by a young white teenager who was in the midst of the mob, let's say, and he noted the fact that many of the men were drunk, that they were enjoying themselves, that for them, and I think this is kind of reflected when you look at photos of lynchings from the time period. You'll often see people smiling or, jokingly pointing at the body that they've murdered, that they've mutilated. And so I think that sense of like revelry involving this vicious racist violence is sort of part and parcel of the era, and certainly was going on in Tulsa on those days.
One of the things in the descriptions, as we've come to know more about the Tulsa massacre in the last 3, 4, 5 years, whatever, one of the things that gets questioned is whether or not there were airplanes and bombs dropped from the airplane. You're pretty sure there were, though, right? Because they found a bomb later?
Yeah, there are a lot of first-hand accounts from Greenwood residents of airplanes being used to shoot down on the neighborhood, drop some kind of incendiary device. And then also there's the fact that Tulsa itself, think about when this was. This is 1921, so right after the Red Scare, the initial communist scare in America. And so Tulsa had really already mobilized for some kind of quote-unquote invasion. Yeah. Tulsa was, they've been doing aerial exercises in Tulsa just in case sort of the commies invaded. They had been experimenting with dropping nitroglycerin from airplanes, kind of like just in case. And so Tulsa certainly had the capacity to do an aerial invasion. Unfortunately, we don't have like all the evidence we'd want about exactly how those airplanes were used. Yeah. But there's certainly enough evidence both from Tulsa's capacity and from Greenwood residents to say that planes were used to attack Greenwood in some way.
Oh, surely. The question that, as we're now, I don't know if we're debating or just in agony about African American history, the Florida Board of Education and curricula here and there, AP credit and so on. But part of the debate that we're having nationally is about Black history, generally speaking. And there is a premise that a lot of Black history that should have been in history curricula all the time was lost. But nothing as large as this has ever been as thoroughly obliterated as this. Obviously, you are from time to time make it perfectly clear of the fantastic irony that the biggest thing is the thing that's been most forgotten. How? I know there's no simple answer, but how does the world forget something as enormous as the Tulsa mess?
I think obviously that it was a very intentional forgetting, I guess is what I would say about it. It was very striking to me when I was doing my research to see actually how thoroughly the race massacre was covered initially. Yeah. Front page news in the New York Times, covered in the Tulsa local white papers for almost a year. But then I think sort of as the legal challenges that were seeking restitution sort of began to gain momentum and become more widespread, that's really when you see the reporting about the massacre kind of disappear from the pages. After about a year in Tulsa, the white newspaper just stopped talking about it at all. And I think that going forward from there, I noticed that sort of the Chamber of Commerce and other groups in Tulsa were really trying to sort of advocate this idea of racial harmony. Even as early as 1925, they were trying to say that we had overcome that dark matter from a few years ago. We've all come together as Black folks and white folks. And so I really think they tried to paper over what happened in a very early time. And living in Tulsa is so striking to meet people I've met people from my age to 70 or 80 telling me they never learned about this in school. No. They never heard about this for the last few years. No. These are folks from the city where it happened. And so I think it was a very intentional obfuscation and something that we're really only overcoming in the last few years.
Well, there are probably no actual living survivors since it's 102 years, but there could be, but not much.
Yeah, actually there is. There's 3 living survivors of the race massacre. Well, Miss Viola Fletcher's 108.
Of course, yes.
Leslie Benny from Randall's 107.
Well, they would have to be, right.
Hughes Van Ellis is 102.
Right.
And I actually got to interview Miss Fletcher, the oldest, for my book, and so I talked to her a little bit about what she remembered, and she remembers the horror herself. And so a lot of times I think folks want to say that this history's so old, why even worry about it anymore? But those folks have to worry about it. It impacted, it transformed their lives, and so I think it's still all of our burden to reckon with this.
This is a tiny point, but it jumped off the page. The insurance companies, these black business owners and black homeowners had insurance.
Yes. Yes.
But the insurance companies tried to wiggle out of paying, or successfully wiggled out of paying.
They did. They did. Again, to go back to Lula, so the Dreamland Theater was totally burned down, but Lula had insurance policies on the theater, and so she filed her claim, seeking to get her payout from the premium she'd been paying for years.
Right.
But the insurance companies claimed that what had unfolded in Greenwood was a riot, and therefore there was an exclusion clause saying that if a riot unfolded, the insurance company didn't have to pay. And so that, I think, speaks to the importance of narrative, because in the white press and other places, right after the events unfolded, there was a narrative going on that sort of the low-class blacks and low-class whites had sort of like had this horrible thing happen against each other, more or less. That provided a legal recourse for insurance companies to not do anything about Lula's needs, And honestly, I think those legal issues, they end up having a really sincere impact on people. Lula herself, after the race massacre, went through a lot of financial challenges, ultimately was forced to give up ownership of multiple theaters, and ultimately ended up passing away with a lot of mental issues in 1927 with what we might think of today as some form of PTSD.
Yes, yeah, it must have been cultural, widespread PTSD.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, there must have been hundreds of people who were traumatized to some degree for the rest of their lives.
I have no doubt about that.
The law that gets passed right after the disaster is a law against building cheap wooden houses.
Yes.
I mean, how obvious, how blatant. This was to keep black folks from rebuilding easily.
Yeah, there really was an effort. I have a chapter in the book called A Conspiracy in Plain Sight about the aftermath of the race massacre. And there was a very concerted effort by white Tulsa to remove black folks from Greenwood and push them farther north. Yeah. We see that happen much later in a different time with highway construction later and gentrification today. But this period after the massacre is probably the first time that it really unfolded. And to your point, one of their efforts was to pass a local ordinance that would make it impossible to build with wooden structures, rebuild wooden structures, and have to use more expensive brick building to rebuild their properties.
It's an odd logic, because the white mob was able easily to burn down wooden houses.
Right.
They don't pass a law against white mobs.
Right.
They pass a law against wooden houses.
Exactly.
It's completely crazy.
Yeah.
In 1979, in Alabama, there was a great hurricane. And after the hurricane cleared Gulf Shores right down to the sand,
Oh, wow.
real estate agents rushed in to talk to people who had lost their houses, to buy them up in their moment of unhappiness and despair and confusion. And we ended up with gigantic condos in a row.
Wow.
Tulsa, the real estate agents, the shark, you call them the sharks, they invade Tulsa right after the massacre.
Yeah. Well, what's great, one inspiration I draw from the Tulsa story, though, is that even though these real estate folks were passing ordinances, trying to be sneaky, trying to buy people out, Greenwood refused, actually. There's a scene in my book about a meeting that the Greenwood folks had in the last church standing in the neighborhood after the race massacre. And J.W. Hughes, who was the elementary school principal, he had this quote, I'm going to keep what I have until I get what I lost. And that really became the mentality of Greenwood. They refused to sell. An attorney in Greenwood actually was able to overcome that sort of discriminatory building ordinance. And ultimately, Greenwood came back kind of bigger and better after the race massacre.
There were, you have rightly reminded me a couple of times that a major theme of the book is your rejection of victimhood and your assertion of resistance at every step, and that is certainly part of it. I wrote a note to myself in the book, melodramatic probably, but Tulsa has been destroyed, Greenwood especially has been destroyed 3 times in the course of your book. The first is the Great Riot burning.
Yeah.
The second was?
Urban renewal and highway construction. There's a freeway through the middle of Greenwood right now.
Yeah. Well, I separated those in my mind. One of them was urban renewal. They tear down houses and build something, projects, whatever.
Yeah.
And then something that we the trick here, and it's hard to pin this in an easy way, but urban renewal is supposed to be a good thing.
Right.
The interstate highway system is supposed to be a good thing.
Right.
But it worked against Greenwood.
Yeah, it really did. I think that those policies were pitched to people in Greenwood and other black communities as a way to revive their own communities. In practice, though, they really became a way to remove people from that area and kind of get them, again, farther from downtown Tulsa, white Tulsa, etc. And so I think that ultimately folks were kind of sold a false bill of goods. And so in the book, I actually been able to follow people like Mabel Little, who survived the race massacre, rebuilt her home, lived in Greenwood until the 1970s, ultimately was forced to leave. And Mabel had a quote at the city council meeting in the 1970s saying that, you know, I was here in 1921, and what you guys are doing to us now in urban renewal is worse than what you did then.
It is, you referenced in the book the controversy in the French Quarter in New Orleans.
Yes.
I knew people involved with that controversy.
Really?
I
Wow.
knew a fellow who wrote a book in New Orleans, very pleased about saving the quarter from the interstate, from the elevated. But of course, the celebration of saving the quarter didn't take into account at all the neighborhood where the interstate and the elevated actually did go.
Right.
Well, one thing, we only have a minute really, but before I ask you about your present project, reparations, very complicated, difficult business, God knows. Coates has done the clearest, I think, explanation of anybody in the Atlantic a few years ago. But the Tulsa situation, looks like there is enough documents, enough lawsuits, enough statistics, bookkeeping. What is your prediction about that in Tulsa?
Yeah, you know, to your point, if you can't get the reparations done in Tulsa, where can you get it done?
Okay.
We have this incredible amount of documentation of what unfolded in 1921. We even saw living survivors who were part of victims of the attack. I think that where it's going to have to come through, though, is probably going to be through either the legislature or the city of Tulsa. You know, the survivors of the attack, the 3 living survivors, they filed a lawsuit in the Oklahoma courts, and it was recently rejected by the courts. It's in appeal right now, but that door is close to being shut, unfortunately. However, when you go to Greenwood and talk to folks, they're never giving up the fight. They're always trying to find a new avenue, a new route. And so I think that fight's going to continue, no matter what various powers that be might say.
Yeah, 1859, that's complicated business. But 1921, that looks clearer.
Oh yeah, I agree with you.
Well, you've written a monstrous good book. Thank you. This has been fun.
Thank you so much.